Es ist Zeit, wieder allein zu sein. Zeit, die Freiheit zu begreifen, sich zu meißeln in den weichen Stein. Es ist Zeit, wieder allein zu sein.
So, looking back, my personal experiences, I retired from the FBI March 1979. At that time, I was in charge of the FBI Los Angeles Division. I had more than 700 personnel under my command. The Attorney General of the United States, Griffin Bell, asked me after I retired if I'd coordinate security for the Pan American Games. I did. I was a consultant in the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. I was a consultant for former Governor Jerry Brown, California Narcotic Authority. So I do have credentials. In the early 1990s, Yorkshire TV came to the United States with a camera crew for 7 months to do a documentary on it. They went back to England, produced the documentary, and they brought it over into the United States. It was listed in the TV Guide to be aired on May the 3rd, 1994. When certain members of Congress found out about it, they threatened the cable industry with restrictive legislation. Somebody anonymously bought up the rights to the videotape or the documentary and ordered all copies destroyed. About 6 months ago, as any good investigator would do, I said, I'm going to get a copy of that TV Guide. I didn't have a copy. John DeCamp had one at one time, couldn't find it. That's typical of John, by the way. Good friend, great guy. And so I said, I'm going to get my own copy. So I wrote to TV Guide people. And I received a copy of the TV Guide for May 3rd, 1994. 10 p.m. Discovery Channel. It's not listed. A nature show is listed instead on the new reprinted edition. I'm not going to be outfoxed by these people. I went to the Los Angeles Times TV log. It's listed, Conspiracy of Silence. I called a friend of mine in Philadelphia and I said, check the TV log for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Conspiracy of Silence is listed in the Philadelphia Inquirer. The power of the press. They changed and reprinted the whole TV Guide. It never has been shown publicly in the United States, and I doubt if it ever will be shown publicly. But as I said, it is available to you.
A Republican from the Midwest, Lawrence E. King, is serving a 15-year prison sentence for a multi-million-dollar fraud. But financial crime is only half the story. This is the true story of Lawrence King. It is the story of an evil at the heart of America, of a cover-up at the highest level. One man is attempting to uncover the full story. John DeCamp is among the most highly decorated Vietnam veterans. A former Republican state senator in Lincoln, Nebraska, he is now a lawyer fighting the legacy of Lawrence King's evil network.
John DeCamp's book on the Franklin scandal itself, the Franklin cover-up, I believe it was called, was elucidating because John himself was a former Phoenix operative, if I understand, basically within the CIA apparatus in Vietnam, right? He was involved with the Phoenix program, working for William Colby, who became CIA director thereafter. So DeCamp is not an uninformed person.
It's a web of intrigue that starts in our Holy of Holies, Boys Town, Nebraska, one of the most respected institutions in the United States, and spreads out like a spider web to Washington, D.C., right up to the steps of the nation's capital, the steps of the White House, involves some of the most respected and powerful and richest businessmen in this United States of America. And the centerpiece of the entire web is the use of children for sex and drug dealing and drug couriers, the compromising of politicians, the compromising of businessmen, but worst of all, the corruption of key institutions of government that have the duty and responsibility to make sure these things never happen.
World-famed Boys Town is in the news again.
Made famous by an Oscar-winning film, Boys Town, Nebraska is America's favorite children's charity. It was founded in 1917 by Father Edward Flanagan.
The saddest spectacle in our social life is the neglected, unwanted, and unloved boy who has become a serious problem in our society.
Boys Town was started to be a home for orphans. That was after World War I. And since then, society has changed and the problems of boys have changed. And so now it's a question of taking care of homeless, abandoned, neglected, abused boys, and now girls also.
With cash reserves of $500 million, Boys Town is the richest square mile in the world. It has been granted the privileges of an incorporated town, a Catholic diocese, and a school district for 500 boys and girls. 1/3 of its annual income is raised from public donations, solicited by begging letters and promotional videos.
I'm Father Val Peter, the caretaker of Father Flanagan's Stream and the executive director of Boys Town. Does Boys Town really exist, people ask me? You bet it does.
Located in the heartland of America, Boys Town youth have come from many backgrounds and locales. As they graduate, they shall seek new adventures and head for different places. But always, they shall carry with them the spirit of Boys Town. If you'd like to help Boys Town, send your tax-deductible gift to Father Val Peter, Boys Town, Nebraska, 68010.
Boys Town, for me, was the first thing I ever heard of when you think of institutions that you respect. Believe it or not, I was there for a while when I was a young boy. Probably worldwide, there's no institution other than Boys Town that has done so much good for so many children over such a long period of time so successfully. When an institution like that gets contaminated, purposes of abusing children instead of protecting children, then you better, if you've got any decency at all, do something about it, or at least get it cleared up.
John DeCamp lays the blame for the contamination of Boys Town on the one-time leader of the National Black Republican Council, Larry King.
Larry King was the fastest rising black star in the entire Republican Party of the United States during all of the 1980s. And he was also one of the most evil individuals in this country in terms of being a dealer of children, in terms of being a thief, 40 million that they documented he stole, and in terms of using and compromising and corrupting one after another politicians.
The base for his network was a small people's bank in Omaha, Nebraska, the Franklin Federal Credit Union. Larry King was its general manager.
Thank you. This is especially an exciting day for me.
Mr. King was a very charismatic person. When he came to the credit union, he was brought in because the credit union was actually failing. He did everything to build the credit union.
King courted the leaders of Omaha's wealthy business district. Banks, industry, and charities placed millions of dollars in King's hands. From 1979, Larry King developed close commercial ties to Boys Town, and Boys Town youngsters were sent to work for his companies.
Boys Town had quite a few accounts at Franklin Credit Union. Those were considered very valuable accounts. They were handled exclusively by the bookkeeping department. But on the average of once a month or once every 2 months, we always seemed to incorporate a person from Boys Town.
King used Boys Town as a source of young boys for his business, and for sex and drug orgies. Paul Banassi was a victim of King's abuse. He was also sent by King to lure Boys Town youngsters off campus.
We used to just drive around and go up toward the home. That's when we used to do some of the scavenger hunts with picking up some of the kids. You know, just kind of win their confidence, become friends with them for a while. Start inviting them to the parties. The kids were 10 years old or older.
In 1986, King's plundering of Boys Town was reported by staff to the chief executive, Father Val Peter. Subsequent testimony proves that he carried out his own investigation, but that King's victims refused to talk.
Nebraska has a very clear statute that child abuse allegations should be reported to authorities. They shouldn't be reported to the principal of a school, director of a facility. They should be reported directly to either Child Protective Services or law enforcement. An internal investigation at Boys Town would have no status. I mean, in other words, that evidence collected may be something that could augment, but it certainly could not take the place of an investigation, a criminal investigation.
Could you understand why a very detailed report from a social worker employed at Boys Town, identifying children and identifying their alleged abusers, never saw the light of day? Nothing happened with that.
No, I couldn't understand that, because had I known that had been, I wouldn't put up with that. But is that something like that happened? I don't know of it. Well, in retrospect, I regret having any association with Larry King. Had I known it at the time, it would never have happened.
Despite the investigation, Larry King remained free to feed his pedophilic parties with child victims. But in 1988, a routine review brought the Boys Town cases to the attention of Nebraska's State Foster Care Review Board.
And the information presented to the Foster Care Review Board, either via the telephone reports, the personal reports, or the reports we reviewed, Larry King's name was consistently present as someone that the youth were making allegations against. I mean, I turned that information over to authorities, and nothing happened. I would say we handed over at least a foot-high amount of material. Generally speaking, the allegations were ignored.
Omaha police now accept that Larry King may have been abusing children.
Good morning, Roberta.
Good morning, Steve.
But its most senior detective claims he never received any evidence.
It is certainly possible that Mr. King was involved in illegal acts with children. If there was sufficient evidence of those types of allegations, he would have been prosecuted by the county attorney's office.
For me, it was very clear that the case was not investigated and not pursued because of the alleged perpetrators.
Those perpetrators named by the children formed a ring of rich and powerful pedophiles in Omaha. Men from industry, politics, the media, even the police. Besides Larry King, ringleaders were department store billionaire Alan Baer and the celebrity columnist of the Omaha World Herald newspaper, Peter Citron. With the judicial system apparently paralyzed, Larry King's political and business empire grew. He courted the Republican Party nationally and plundered Franklin's accounts to finance a luxury lifestyle of limousines, private planes and palatial homes, 3 in Omaha and 1 in Washington, D.C. Franklin's records show he spent $10 million on jewelry, flowers and private planes. And his lavish spending bought him a charmed life.
Larry King was constantly heralded, cheered, applauded in the news media as the great businessman that's helping the poor people, the black community of Omaha.
But King's extravagance attracted the attention of the Internal Revenue Service. As a result, on April the 11th, 1988, the Franklin Credit Union was raided and closed by the FBI. King was arrested, and a federal investigation showed he'd stolen $40 million from Franklin. But the FBI's inquiries were secret, and evidence of King's sex ring was quickly covered up. In November 1988, Nebraska's state government set up a parallel investigation into the Franklin financial collapse. A legislative committee was formed. Its chairman was the Republican head of Nebraska's banking committee, corn farmer and state senator Lawrence Schmidt. But the money trail led quickly to the original allegations of child abuse, and almost immediately anonymous threats began.
I received a phone call on the floor of the legislature. The caller did not identify himself, but he said, "Lauren, you do not want to have an investigation of the Franklin Federal Credit Union." And I asked who I was speaking to, and they said, "That doesn't matter, but you shouldn't have that investigation." And I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "It will reach to the highest levels of the Republican Party." And we're both good Republicans.
The night before we testified before the legislative committee, I did receive a phone call at home that said, "If you speak, you won't live to regret it."
Undeterred, Schmidt's committee hired professional investigators Karen Ormiston and Gary Caradori.
When we hired Mr. Caradori, I was very specific to him. I said, "We do not want you to bring to the committee rumors, innuendos, nothing that cannot be backed up with facts." I said, "Bring to the committee that which we can take to a prosecutor."
On the streets of Omaha, Gary Caradori and Karen Ormiston found new victims of King's paedophile network. Every new youngster told the same stories as those from Boys Town, covered up 3 years earlier.
They were telling us about prominent people in Omaha and elsewhere that were abusing children at parties.
The prominent citizens' names that originally came up were of concern to me because I knew many of those individuals, and I very frankly was shocked to have those names show up on the list.
Ormiston and Caradori recorded their new witnesses on videotape. A victim of abuse since he was 8, Paul Benassi was present at many of Larry King's sex parties.
Who were some of these people that would come to these parties? Larry King, Peter Citron, and Wilson Wise. He didn't seem like he was like people.
Media personality Peter Citron procured some of his victims from Boys Town.
The kids he liked were mainly around the age of probably about 8 and 13. It was mainly fondling and oral sex with them. He did have some anal sex, but he usually did that with the older kids.
But Citron's abuse of Paul Benassi involved ever more sadistic parties.
He ended up tied me up and
You okay?
yeah. They tied me up and had some other kids perform sex on me, and they were hitting me and they burned me some cigarettes.
Okay. Just take a deep breath out. Whenever you were tied up, was there anybody else present other than you, Peter Citron, and Danny King?
Yes.
Who was that?
It was Alan Bear sometimes, Larry King.
Troy Bonner would tie you up?
I was there.
Troy Bonner was 17 when he was introduced to the paedophile parties by Alan Bear.
He lifted me up, kind of moved me over to the bed, said, "Let's get on the bed," and put his head down, started performing oral sex on me while his penis was at my end.
As they say, a 69 position.
Yeah.
Alan Bear was a sick fuck. Didn't care, wanted sex, nasty, you know, I don't even know if you can call it sex, you know, and take it any way he can get it, pay for it, he'd like to, but if he had to take it by force, he would. Larry King was the same kind of sick fuck Alan Bear was, except Larry King was more violent, more sure of himself, you know. I mean, I would, you know, see him fuck a 10-year-old boy in the ass, you know, until he bled, and, you know, just pull out and stop, and, you know, push him down, you know, and then go out and, you know, meet with decent people.
King would also provide underage girls for abuse. Alicia Rowan was 15 when she attended her first party.
I met some guys there that were from Boys Town, and it was at that party that I met Larry King. At the time that I met Larry King, I did not know that he was Larry King. I had met him. That was the first time I'd ever met him.
Alan Bear and Larry King frequently hosted the child sex parties in penthouse apartments at the Twin Towers luxury block.
A lot of it was me handcuffed with my hands behind my head and my feet tied, and doing different things.
What do you mean?
Sometimes there'd be a guy straddling over my face.
Okay.
Most of the time, Larry King took pictures quite a bit during that time.
I know it's difficult.
I don't know.
Okay.
And I think I could have said no.
Okay.
But I don't know.
Okay. And you know, Alicia, you're a victim. And at a young age, let's go off camera for a minute.
We were appalled. It was incredible. It's incredible what these kids went through, I think.
I was shocked when I walked in. There was a kid, I would say about 15 years old, out in the middle of the room. One guy was standing in front of him. He was bent over, and the other guy was like reaching under him, playing with his nipples, while a guy whom Jeff told me was a police officer shoving beads up his rectum.
The police officer was shoving beads up his rectum?
Yes.
Everything, I mean, from just, you know, touching to, you know, fruit, squash, you know, huge squash, you know, that big around, you know, stuck into you, into your ass, you know. Heat things, hot things, you know, poked at you and stuck in you, you know. I got those scars on my arm one night at a party where Larry King was, and he had brought somebody, I don't clearly remember who it was, you know, wanted to see how strong a men we were or something, you know, and have us push our arms together. And you push your arms together. King has these same scars. And you push them tight together, and then you light cigarettes, and as soon as you get burning, you just drop them down between your arms and, you know, let it burn. You know, and they made us stand there naked and touch each other by holding our arms together and burn cigarettes. You know, it's on film someplace. I mean, they filmed it, burning, you know.
And those of us that didn't like to be involved and didn't want to be involved were threatened.
Oh, so and who would do these threatening remarks?
Larry King.
You think Larry King personally did?
I think he did. And when they threatened, you know, that I can go find somebody that will kill you, and it will kill your family, he didn't tell anybody.
Larry King was also here. He came in and we drank and did cocaine. I didn't do much, and he turned me on to what Larry King did.
He didn't like me because, you know, I would get high on drugs, you know, and I would question him about, you know, how can you do that? I mean, once I asked him, you know, I got you know, beat up by it. I came home here a lot of times beat to shit from, you know, misspeaking my tongue, so to speak, and, you know, just telling them how I felt sometimes.
Drugs was a strong part of how they got control of some of the kids, because that's what some of the kids were there to get. They would do the sexual acts and then be provided with cocaine or whatever type of drug they wanted.
Heroin, you know, I don't know, but that was my drug of choice, you know. Till this day I remain an addict, you know.
Larry King was, I would say, the center of transporting the children around the country. The airplanes were usually in his name, at least in his name. They were paid for by Larry King.
We met them in Pasadena.
Met who in Pasadena?
We met, Larry King was there. There was 3 boys that I had seen at one of the receptions at the French Cafe were there. And I'm almost positive they were Boys Town boys. Almost positive. They were there.
You mean graduates of Boys Town or present?
I think they were present because they were young.
Well, how would they get away for a long period of time?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Boys Town came up frequently during the investigation, but we found it very difficult to get information about Boys Town. I was not able to find any information on my visit there, and Mr. Caradori could not get information either.
"4 years on, Boys Town remains unwilling to discuss its involvement with Larry King. We asked for an interview with Chief Executive Father Val Peter, but Boys Town's public affairs officer refused.
I would have to give you a flat no. I'm just going to tell you at this point that we will not participate with you. We have no interest in talking to you folks. It's something that we don't even care to delve into.
Hi.
Hi, is Father Val Peter available, please?
You can check in his office. It's the first one on the...
Thank you very much. We're here because we have to give Father Val Peter and Boys Town every opportunity to talk to us about the very serious allegations.
Please turn your recorder off. Please step outside.
Why is it that Boys Town is unwilling to discuss your relationship with Larry King?
We don't have a relationship with Larry.
I'm afraid papers that we possess show that Boys Town had a relationship with Larry King.
I just suggest you be very careful about what you report. Excuse me.
So,
unless you leave.
By the spring of 1989, so serious were the child abuse allegations before the Franklin Committee that its chairman, Lawrence Schmidt, sought the advice of his lawyer, John DeCamp. He told Schmidt to turn over all the evidence to the FBI. Immediately, the videotaped testimony was leaked to a hostile media.
The media immediately started discrediting the witnesses. They were... the witnesses came across in the media, in the Omaha World Herald, especially, as the criminals.
The last 3 victim witnesses were demolished by the press, particularly the Omaha World Herald. The paper never looked for information that would support any of the allegations. The whole purpose of the stories was to destroy any credibility that these youth may have.
I've heard that people said that Gary Caradori coached me and that he told me what to say, but the fact was I didn't meet Gary Caradori until way after I'd already talked to the Omaha police about the abuse and had named all the same people. And they didn't ask me very much about Larry King or even Alan Bear at all. They treated the allegations that I made about the people who abused me almost like a joke.
The information did not come our way. It was given, as I said, to the FBI and Nebraska State Patrol. They conducted their own investigations of the information. The stories were of such significance that the investigators first wanted to prove the accuracy of the stories. As they set about the investigation of the 3, initially 3, and then a 4th person who were telling the stories, as the investigation developed, it became obvious to the investigators that the information was not accurate, that in fact It was an entire conspiracy of allegations, none of which had any truth to them.
The kids, of course, talked about satanic cult ceremonies. They talked about the kidnapping ring. Paul's life has been turned upside down because he refused to recant, as did Alicia Owens, the other person who refused to recant. Alicia's still serving time in prison for lying to the grand jury. She was convicted of that. When she was 14 years old, she had sex with the chief of police, Bob Wadman. That's what she said. And the other kids backed her up. Other top businessmen who were identified were Harold Anderson, publisher of the Omaha World Herald, the head of the Society page in Omaha, Eugene Mahoney, who was a former Vice Squad police officer in Omaha and is now head of the Forestry Service for the state of Nebraska. And the list goes on and on and on.
Paul Benassi came forward in the early 1990s, and I think if the police and the FBI had given him any credibility whatsoever, they could have probably found Johnny Gosch. But because the FBI was so concerned about covering up Lawrence King's pedophile network, they couldn't give Paul Benassi any credibility. So ultimately, any leads that were gleaned from Paul Benassi were completely ignored by law enforcement.
Seems every time I want to try and do something to help people, it gets pushed right back in my face. I mean, what I want to do is try and help find these guys who do this stuff.
I was just supposed to hold this person down in the back of a car and put this stuff over his face.
And that was Johnny?
Mm-hmm.
Paul Benassi was a victim of a child prostitution network that was centered in Omaha, Nebraska. And 9 years after Johnny Gosch's abduction, Paul Benassi came forward and claimed that he helped abduct Johnny Gosch. That was the big bang in the Johnny Gosch case.
24-year-old Paul Benassi, a victim of sexual abuse since the age of 6. He is himself a convicted sex offender and has been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder.
I can hear what these other personalities are saying and stuff and the things they've done. I mean, like with Johnny and...
We spoke to Benassi recently at the Nebraska State Prison. He showed us dozens of portraits drawn and signed by the personalities which haunt him.
This is a bunch of the different personalities right here.
It is only through these personalities that he remembers the day he helped kidnap Johnny Gosch.
Every time he would put his head down and call up somebody, it seemed authentic. It seemed to me that he couldn't fake that. This guy probably wasn't capable of coming up with all these voices and all these different things to say.
Benassi can call forth his alter egos at will. First to emerge, Mark Anderson, 15 years old.
All I remember him talking about was that this was the boy that they were going to, one of the boys they were going to take.
Paul says a Des Moines accomplice snuck up from behind as the abduction was made. Benassi did his part, chloroforming Johnny.
I held him down for a second. I put this thing that immediately told me to over his face, and he, a few seconds later, he went out.
I don't know how long we shot, but I think we filled up every tape that I had. Jim, who is as unflappable a guy as you can get, he just, handles everything well. At one point, just turned around and like looked at me in disbelief, like, what do I make of all of this? Jim always has a handle on it, and even Jim didn't have a handle on what was going on there.
Benassi says child pornography, sex magazines and films involving children as young as the age of 6 had always been the reason behind Johnny Gosch's abduction.
After it was over with, me and Mike talked to him and told him it was going to be all right, that if he just did everything he was told to, he'd be alive. That we didn't know what was going to happen to him, but at least he'd live.
When Paul Benassi first surfaced, I needed some time before I could go to the prison and sit down and meet with him. I could have strangled him, but I also knew that he had been forced to do it. He had been a victim also by the same people.
I don't have hatred for Paul at all. I thought I would, and a lot of people want me to, but I don't feel that.
The video can't pick up just how badly Noreen Gosch is shaking as she sees Paul Benassi in the flesh for the first time. He fills out a consent form, not knowing who this woman is.
It's Johnny's mother. Mrs. Gosch wanted to talk to you.
Just tell me what happened, please.
I feel so bad about it because what they made me do.
It was a moment in time that I'll never forget. I was anxious, I was upset, but I was thankful to him for going out on a limb to share it. He didn't have to. He didn't get a better deal. He still had to serve his sentence. So I had to admire the young man for the courage to do that.
Benassi drew a map of the Klan, a replica of one drawn by the kidnappers. Noreen Gosch says this X marks the exact spot of the abduction. She says most people mistakenly believe it happened at the corner.
Why did they want Johnny? Everybody asks me that. I don't know the answer.
They wanted to get kids that weren't used, and they also like to get kids that were close to their families.
Why?
You don't like to hurt people.
They did a good job of that.
This is a composite sketch of Emilio. The mastermind of the plot gave Benassi the job of chloroforming Johnny.
Is everything that you're telling me the truth about Johnny?
Yes. Absolutely.
For me, hearing all of this, it was just like my whole body seized up. I kept thinking, oh, I can't listen to any more, but I have to. I have to hear the rest of what he has to say. That they kept him tied and gagged a good share of the time, and that Paul was indeed the first one to molest him on film. The kidnappers took pictures of that to either advertise him for sale or in some way entice another pedophile to pay for services.
He talked about something about meditation, but I don't know what that meant, or yoga, or some kind of... And then when he said something about that he'd seen his mom do that or something, or she taught him how to do that.
I have never told the press that Johnny went with me to yoga classes. It wasn't relevant to his kidnapping. Did you ever see any marks or anything on Johnny's body?
When we got him in there, he had a birthmark on his chest, or something on his chest. It was like looked like South America.
While information on Johnny's large chest birthmark was widely circulated, Benassi described other markings which were never made public. A scar on Johnny's tongue. Noreen says he bit through his tongue after falling from a treehouse. A white scar on Johnny's leg just above the ankle. He'd received a burn after touching the hot tailpipe of his brother's motorcycle. Benassi also described the stammer Johnny suffered when he was upset.
These are all things that start to fit a puzzle that we've known about for a long time, and these are important things. They might be little things, and they might not be big things to the police department, but it's forming a picture.
After viewing our unedited interview, West Des Moines police say Benassi said little to prove that he had first-hand knowledge of the crime.
There is no way right now that you can say, I'm convinced and we got to go talk to him. You can't say that at this point.
I can't myself at this time, no.
I would have to think that after all the years and all the frustration and all the dead ends, what does it hurt to go and talk to him? I mean, why not do that? Kind of tends to that whole conspiracy theory type flavor that the whole thing has. Is why won't they? Why don't, I mean, just go out there and eliminate that as a possibility for once and for all, if you can do that.
And so investigators from this department went to Omaha. They did not interview Paul Benassi, but they did interview his siblings. His siblings put him in Omaha at the time of the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. Now, we can only go on the information that was given to us, so that's information that says we shouldn't continue to go down the path of Paul Benassi based on what his siblings are saying. And that's how we do it, is evaluate that evidence. So you can make a judgment on that. We'll stand by what we've done.
takes 2 hours to get from Omaha to Des Moines. And if you've kidnapped somebody, you're probably driving faster. I mean, you could get there and back in a day, and your sister might not know you're gone. I don't know.
You realize you're hanging all your hopes on a child molester who's done unspeakable things to your son.
There's just been so many things that Paul has shared with us that would have been impossible for him to know had he not been with Johnny.
Among that information, letters to Bonacci from around the country that he says are from members of the alleged sex ring that kidnapped Johnny Gosch, complete with descriptions of Johnny's physical condition and his whereabouts.
You think you can help find Johnny?
Yes.
You think he's alive?
Yes.
You've got a case that's been unsolved for 10 years. I would think you'd be kicking the doors down to want to talk to him at this point.
When the time is right, again, I will reiterate, we may well interview Paul Bonacci, but it will be when we're ready to do it.
How much more time has to go by?
I have no idea.
It is a major cover-up.
We can't get law enforcement help. This is when we need it. We can't take somebody to court without them, and they know it.
There was so much information put out about this case. And of course, the mother would certainly know more than anyone that he had information that wasn't publicized. But I'm skeptical, I really am. I think some of these people were con men who knew how to take advantage of the situation.
I know what it's like to search for your missing child. I know what it's like to not know what happened. And so I thought, let's go back and look. Maybe somebody will have the guts to finally tell us what happened to Johnny.
For 10 years, there have been sightings, but Johnny's never been found. 2 years ago, a convicted child molester surfaced and said he helped kidnap Johnny. Bonacci claims that an organized ring of pedophiles abducts children and forces them into a life of child pornography and prostitution, and that it happened to him.
America's Most Wanted was focused on missing children because our host, John, had had his son abducted and killed. And so we did a lot of stories about missing children, and as the anniversary approached of Johnny's abduction, it was one of those stories we wanted to look at. We didn't know who we were going after, and we had a missing child who'd been missing for 10 years. And the FBI was waving us off right from the very beginning, saying these are not credible witnesses, we don't believe this information is valid. So we went into it pretty skeptically, particularly when you have a character like Paul Bonacci, who was clearly suffering from multiple personality disorder, who had huge credibility issues, and who had been in prison.
These people, when they get a hold of young kids and stuff, you know, they force you to do things, and they photograph it, they film it. And the whole purpose for that is to either blackmail you into staying with them or to split your mind up so that you don't even remember who you are.
Paul Bonacci's a tough read. There were so many facts that he seemed to know that lots of people didn't know. And the Gosches were convinced that the only way Paul knew those facts was if he had talked to Johnny.
Paul claims to have seen Johnny in 1986 on a trip to Colorado, where Johnny was being kept by a man called the Colonel.
I guess he tried to run away from it one time and they branded him.
We gave some airtime to Paul Bonacci's story. He talked about the branding. He talked about what were pretty amazing accusations. And then these kids started calling us. This one kid came forward named Jimmy who had the brand and was telling these stories and confirming what Bonacci was talking about. We went to Colorado with Bonacci. You know, he said, I'll show you the house where they used to keep us. And he described this house with this secret underground chamber where they would hide the kids when the police would come. And there it was.
So what happened here?
God. I remember this house being where they brought us. They kept us here and made sure that we couldn't leave, and I almost couldn't do it to even go near the house because I got up there and the memories flooded back of the last time I was here.
Before we went in the building, I described it. And there was a little grate. We pulled the grate off stuff and they looked under and they're like, oh no. Here's the hole.
It's abandoned. We go underneath it, and sure enough, there's this chamber dug out under the house with kids' initials carved in the wood.
This is where they kept some of the kids hidden away out underneath of here, so that if anyone ever tried to come looking for them, they could run them underneath the house here.
And so that there was this sense that we're really close, you know, something is going on here. But every time we found a clue, we ran into a brick wall. The owner of the house, which had been abandoned, was a former prison guard who disappeared. You know, the people who had composite drawings never became real people. We never had names. We never could go after them as individuals. We couldn't expose them and get them brought in for questioning. There's the things you think are true, there's the things you know are true, and then there are the things you can prove in court. And the only thing that matters is what can you prove in court. And we didn't have anything that we could prove in court. The Johnny Gosch case has haunted me, you know, in a way that nothing else that I encountered on America's Most Wanted has. And we encountered horrific crimes. If America's Most Wanted, with all of our resources, couldn't solve this case, then chances are no one would. And as I looked around, no one else was trying to solve the case.
I've been investigating the cover-up of a pedophile network for about 10 years. This child prostitution network was centered in Omaha, Nebraska, and they flew children from coast to coast and pandered them to the rich and powerful. The network also deployed blackmail to compromise the rich and the powerful. That's when I first heard Johnny Gosch's name.
Paul Benassi first came forward and told his story about Johnny's kidnapping to his attorney.
And how do you know that Paul is telling the truth about this?
Number one, Paul had repeated the very same story, word for word, to his attorney before I ever went to see him. He never changed a word.
I was a young senator at the time and was hearing these strange, insane stories from kids that were telling about how they were sexually involved with this prominent individual or that prominent individual. And I get this letter from a kid in jail who had just been arrested. A kid named Paul Benassi.
Now later you took his diary that went back like 5 years and had ink experts, forensic experts look at it. He'd written all this stuff down.
Yeah, that was the strange thing about this kid. He was about 18 at the time I met him in jail there, 17, 18. As a young kid, his uncle or grandfather or somebody had taught him religiously to keep a diary, you know, where you mark things down every day. Well, he did her, and he did her in detail. As I got at the very beginning of this story and working on it, one of the things that I did do was, as you say, obtain the diaries of this young boy to see just what he did say, and then I had them checked.
And it wasn't just that. I mean, they grabbed a bunch of
experts, and the forensics were because somebody said, well, he could have made this all up later, you know. He could have made this up later. And so I wanted to make sure that wasn't done, and so we had forensics examined and said, well, this ink was done at a certain time, this could only have been done, and on and on and on.
And it led to a horrible, horrible, horrible picture of young children being used to provide sexual pleasure for adults, and in so many of the cases, very prominent adults.
I don't know who they all are. All I know is the guys that were controlling everything. I was not a kept kid. I was not a one for sale that way, because I was doing things other for them that they didn't want to sell me. Plus, I was damaged goods. These guys wanted kids that had not been involved in any sexual stuff. And Johnny got bought by a guy that was actually in Colorado, so he ended up there. And he'd been with a lot of guys there too that this guy had made him for money. So, but he never got the money, the guy got the money.
There were two different kinds of kids. There were the throwaway kids, the runaways, drug addicts living on the street, hustling for sex. And then there were the virgins, and that some of these sick individuals would pay large sums of money to have clean kids to abuse. And that's the part of the story that I found most horrific and most disturbing.
Before Paul even admitted that he abducted Johnny Gosch, he was receiving letters from kids around the country who did discuss Emilio and who also discussed JG. So I think that that's pretty powerful evidence that Paul did take part in Johnny Gosch's abduction and that Emilio was involved.
We couldn't find any reason why he would be making this up. The dates of some of his earlier interviews with John DeCamp and some of the recordings that he made early on, these things sort of predated a lot of the publicity. So yes, it's possible that he could have gotten some of those details, but it seems highly unlikely. Now, whether he was actually there, I don't know. Did he know people who was there? I think that's very likely. Did he know Johnny Gosch at some point after the abduction? Yes, I believe he did.
A grand jury investigated and called the allegations a carefully crafted hoax. Benassi was charged with perjury, but the perjury charges were eventually dropped. During the investigation, the court-appointed psychiatrist diagnosed Benassi as having multiple personality disorder caused by years of sexual abuse.
The only people I ever spoke to about it was some media. And they kept asking me if anybody had come to talk to me about it. And it's like, nobody's really come to investigate anything. Nobody's come to, hear anything I have to say about it.
Sometimes there are forces just too powerful, people just too big and rich, and interests that you don't even understand or know anything about involved that make it impossible for them to allow you to succeed in getting this exposed or corrected.
Excellent. Are you familiar with the Johnny Gosch case? He was an Iowa paperboy who disappeared 30 years ago.
I am not personally familiar with that case.
But do you know about it?
We agreed that we would not talk about the Johnny Gosch case at all.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't know that.
There will be no questions about that.
How are
I could not get my breath. And I thought I was going to pass out at seeing my son like that. And if you look closely at this one, over in this area, there's dark pigmentation. It is not a shadow. That is the birthmark that Johnny had. It was always up in that area of his chest.
The hair texture looks similar, but the face was too small. We can scan in that entire image, isolate the face, but when we make it larger, it gets really worse, and all the details that we're looking for just aren't there. So it wasn't a good candidate for a serious facial comparison.
First of all, there's no birthmark on his chest, and the picture does not even look like him. His feet were much larger than that even when he was kidnapped. So your feet, even if you lost a lot of weight, still stays the same length. So.
We located a law enforcement agency in Florida who has identified the specific pictures to say that was a case we worked. We identified some of the individuals in those pictures. Those pictures did not have Johnny Gosch in them.
These boys were all from Florida. This is a case that I worked in 1979. It was a case that involved several boys tied up and gagged. Of course, when I saw the pictures, there was no doubt in my mind that this subject was a pedophile. None of the boys ever admitted that anything happened to them, so no arrests were ever made.
Have you ever seen this before?
I can't say that I remember that one, though. You know, that was 33 years ago. I can't really recall this one.
Those photographs are my son, and you know, it matters not to me if people think it isn't Johnny. We know that it is, and the West Des Moines police are mistaken.
I was very disappointed with the way the FBI and law enforcement treated the victims. They, in fact, turned them into the offenders, so to speak. And instead of taking the evidence that was delivered to them by the victims and interrogating the persons whom the victims identified, they seemed to bear down and try to get the victims to change their story.
Troy Bonner was brought in for questioning by the FBI.
The FBI's attitude was, you know, just no, that these kind of things don't happen. From the first interview when I went, you know, and realized they don't believe a fucking thing I'm saying, you know, I mean, they were just appalled, but I realized what that look in their eye was back then. It was fear. It was fear of every, you know, I mean, I had witnessed, you know, firsthand things that would, you know, destroy this city, you know, people, a position, you know what I mean? It's not going to be believed, they said. It will not be believed. You will be found guilty of perjury, and you, I mean, they weren't telling me maybe. You know, they were saying, there's no way. You go on with this story, you're going to jail. I mean, that was said to me direct. Just out of fear, I came to recant the story out of fear.
Troy Bonner agreed to recant his videotaped testimony and state instead that his evidence had been invented. Next, the FBI used Troy in an attempt to trap Alicia Owen into recanting her evidence about Larry King's ring of powerful pedophiles. The phone call, recorded by the FBI on March the 9th, 1990, proves conclusive evidence for John DeCamp.
This is Special Agent Michael F. Mott. The following will be a consensually recorded telephone call between Troy Bonner and Alicia Owen.
Hello. Hi. Hey, what's going on?
I'd like to ask you that.
Talk to me.
No, you talk to me. I don't understand why you're lying. Why are you lying?
What are you talking about?
That's what I'm asking you.
You're calling me why I'm lying? Yeah. You concocted this whole thing, Alicia.
You're full of shit.
Either tell me what's going on.
You're full of shit.
Hey, look.
Who do you have listening on the line?
I have nobody listening to me. I'm listening to you, and I'm hoping you give me some fucking answers.
I'll be honest with you. I don't know what kind of game you're playing.
I'm not trying to play a game.
And I don't know who you have listening on this phone call.
You're being stupid, Alicia. I'm not going to go to jail for you. And that's what's going to happen.
Why don't you go to jail? Jail for telling the truth?
No, jail for lying.
What have you lied about?
I haven't lied.
Okay, then, but why are...
Listen, shut up. Listen to me. You're not out here being talked to them every day. The pressure's kind of hard.
You literally have to have bricks for brains to take on the FBI in this country. And that's exactly what you'd have to do this properly. They now, in my opinion, in my investigation, are the architects of the cover-up.
We asked the FBI for an interview about its investigation of the Franklin scandal.
Larry Holmquist with the FBI here. We feel it would be inappropriate for us to comment. We work this with the Omaha Police Department, and we just don't feel it would be appropriate for us to make comments.
As Gary Caradori and Karen Ormiston sought out new witnesses on the streets of Omaha, they found themselves under constant threat.
Gary was threatened several times. His vehicles were tampered with. I would think whoever tampered with them, it was a scare tactic because it was so obvious that they were being tampered with.
Gary there was one piece of evidence I know he got that he even said he got one step ahead of them this time. he told us about this book. It was like addresses, telephone numbers, names. He said if they knew he had it, they'd kill him.
On July the 11th, 1990, Gary Caradori and his 8-year-old son AJ were flying home from Chicago. They had watched the All-Stars baseball game, and Caradori had been pursuing new leads.
Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are in Harold Cameron's cornfield trying to determine what caused this private plane to crash, killing its 2 occupants.
The bodies of Gary Caradori and AJ were found in the wreckage.
National Transportation Safety Board investigators say wreckage from the crash is apparently strewn over a 3/4 to 1 mile long stretch in this field.
The fact that the wreckage is scattered over a large area certainly demonstrates that it did break up in flight. The exact mechanism of breakup yet is still unknown.
The federal investigation was never able to discover what tore the plane apart.
So again, in terms of your investigation, you basically followed up where the Senate subcommittee ultimately left off, because there were no charges brought against people like Lawrence King on the pedophile matter, correct?
Yes, I had Gary Caradori, who I mentioned previously. He was the investigator for the Senate subcommittee, and he died mysteriously. And I managed to acquire all his investigative reports and all his investigative documentation. I had a list of over 60 victims. And it was up to me to put it all together. I drove around the country looking for victims, and these kids were very, very hard to find.
I replaced a fellow named Gary Caradori, who was the investigator for a Nebraska Senate committee. Gary met the official photographer of the group, who had split from the group, defected, and agreed to take the pictures that this official photographer gave him, and they met in Chicago, agreed to take the pictures back to the committee. He flew out of Chicago in his private plane, a short distance out of Chicago. The plane exploded in midair. He and his 11-year-old boy died. His briefcase has never been found. The rear seat of the airplane has never been found. I had made every attempt possible to obtain possession of or control of that plane, because I wanted to examine it for bomb chemicals, particularly the back seat. It's no longer available. Nobody knows what happened to it. Gary Caradori was a civilian, yet it was taken to a military base for examination. A deputy sheriff was the first one on the scene. He saw the pictures. He started picking up the pictures. An FBI agent came along, took the pictures away from him, told him to keep his mouth shut. He started talking to a few people. A year later, his wife was murdered. He's no longer talking.
So, unfortunately, the investigator prior to my entering the case, Gary Caradori, had learned about some pictures. And these pictures were the smoking gun of the case. Pictures of politicians having sex with children and other unbelievable acts, boys and girls and so forth. So the official photographer of the group was a fellow named Russell Nelson. And Rusty was a farm boy from Nebraska. He had never seen the bright lights of the big city. And he was enamored with the rich and the famous and the jet airplanes and the trips around the world, actually. And he was a professional photographer, and he started out by working in a gay club, taking pictures for the club, and he was recruited from there into the sex ring. Rusty was not himself homosexual, I'm convinced of it. I've spent quite a bit of time with him. He, in connection with his work, would sneak a roll of film in on occasion when he was photographing these acts, because they were taking the, quote, official film away from him as soon as it was completed. Rusty sent these pictures back home, and he also scattered them around the United States, negatives and photographs themselves. He was sold for sex by Larry King to a businessman in Washington, D.C., and he said to the businessman, "Let me go in the bathroom and wash up," and instead of coming back out, he went out the back window and he disappeared. He was living on a farm, one of his parents' farms in Nebraska, for quite a while. And the FBI came around to his parents' home asking for Rusty. And the mother said, "Well, he's over at such and such a farmhouse." They went over and interviewed him. And of course, it was basically, as he told me, it was an harassment. And then he left and had to go into hiding someplace else. His folks came back several months later to the farm to check it out. It had been abandoned, but it was a beautiful place, 1.5 miles from any neighbor. And somebody had gone in with high-powered rifles and totally destroyed it, tipped over the furnace. They shot 13 bullets through the refrigerator door, front, out the back, and out the house. You know what a powerful weapon that had to be. They shot bullets into the ceiling and out the walls. There was a van outside that was running. They shot it up, broke all the windows. I asked Rusty, in fact, I asked him on camera, how and who would know that this was there, that you were there, and so forth. He said the only people that knew were his parents and then the FBI. He's convinced that this was a tactic by the FBI. Rusty, after the FBI interviewed him on his farm, decided he had to hit the road, and so he obtained a van and some window washing equipment. This is pretty clever of what he did, because he knew that they'd be tracing him, looking for him. And he drove all over the United States, in and out of towns, and washed windows. No record of a pay stub. But unfortunately, about 3 years later, they caught up with him in Portland, Oregon. And he was arrested for having a broken taillight. In the back of his van, he had pictures of nudes, which professional photographers do on a regular basis, nothing pornography. And the police told him that there was a picture of a juvenile in the back of the van, and therefore they arrested him, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He never faced his accuser. They would never tell him the name of the person who was supposedly a juvenile.
Let's start by, first of all, talking a little bit about you, your background. You're a professional photographer.
Ended up in Omaha, went to a bar called the Mac. Probably get me a job as a waiter or something like that. Lo and behold, the man was Larry King. I had no idea who he was. It was just a whirlwind. He had all this money and power. And within a couple days, I was off on a private jet.
When you say important people, Rusty, are you talking about political?
It went all the way up to the White House. These people were leaders of industry. They were doing things that I did not feel was right. Who would you go tell? Because they pulled the puppet strings. There was one instance where Colonel Michael Aquino came to a motel room, and he got from Larry King a suitcase, and it was filled with bearer bonds and cash. There was millions of dollars in that thing. It was for the Iran-Contras. Embassy Row in Washington, D.C. They had parties there. On the surface, they looked like all up and up. Then the party was over with, and there'd be a few guys that would stay after. They would have a sex party. This was at King's house.
Okay.
Within 24 hours of the tragedy, FBI agents impounded all records of the investigation. Gary's widow, Sandy, is still unable to come to terms with her loss.
As a mother, I don't want to ever think that somebody murdered my child, let alone my husband. But I think if you'd ever talk to any parent, be it mother or father, that's ever lost a child, I mean, the worst thing that you can think of is that somebody would want to murder a child.
I really feel that somebody killed my brother. And inside me, I know that somebody killed my brother. If somebody could help us out somewhere, somebody knows something. And may God help those who did that to him and his family.
Gary Caradori's death pricked Troy Bonner's conscience. He promised Sandy that he would recant his recantation and tell the truth.
I set the record straight. I was, going to do it. And would, the truth would come out, and somebody would be held accountable for his death. And then at the funeral I had seen, FBI guys, and they looked at me. I was supposed to meet Senator Labette and Schmidt for lunch after the funeral. And, that's when I decided, I told my mom, we're not going to do the lunch. We're going to hightail it out of Lincoln now.
The effect of Gary's crash on the investigation, I think, in effect, put an end to anybody else coming forward with sensitive information like this.
That's when I was finished, because I figured out if they murdered Gary and his son, there was nothing that would stop them. There was no piece of paper, there was nothing we could come up with that was going to get anything done.
Under pressure from the FBI, Troy Bonner agreed to tell a Douglas County grand jury investigating Larry King that he and Alicia Owen had concocted the entire child abuse story on payment of a $500 bond. Troy Bonner was to be the star witness against Alicia Owen, but he grew uneasy about maintaining what he claims were the lies fed to him by the FBI. But when his brother Sean died in an inexplicable gun accident, Troy and his family were convinced they'd been sent a warning message.
And they killed him just flat outright, somehow, professionally, made something happen, to shut me up.
The purpose of Sean's death? To instill fear. And it worked.
Do I feel guilty about my brother? Yes, I do. That's where all this is coming from. That's where the energy is coming from, that I'm getting to do this. Is for him, because, it should have been me there instead of him. Really. I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad, but he was brilliant and innocent. It should have been me. He had so much to give. I've taken so much. It should have been the other way around.
I can explain to you what it feels like to lose a child. But when you see the pain your kids have because of that, it's much worse. I can't do anything for them. I can't take that pain away for them.
Lauren Schmidt's legislative committee issued a report denouncing the grand jury. 2 months later, it was disbanded, leaving Schmidt a broken man.
The message was not lost on most politicians in Nebraska. I think the message that was delivered was, if any legislative committee ever tries to conduct a thorough investigation again, the same thing will happen. It has shaken my faith in the institutions of government. I used to be a firm believer that the system would work, and that people who did things wrong would be punished. And we discovered victims who claimed to have been abused and who the grand jury acknowledged had been abused. But they did not try to find out who had abused those individuals. Instead, they convicted Alicia Owen of perjury. Indefensible from my point of view.
In July 1991, Alicia Owen was convicted of perjury. Her sentence was between 9 and 25 years.
I can't find a case in the history of this country where some kid got sentenced to 25 or 30 years in prison for something like this. If you were going to pick a what I call a tell sign, something that says something fishy about the whole thing, it was in the sentencing itself. For some reason, they had to send a signal to every kid who was a potential witness. My opinion again. A signal so loud and clear, if you dare to come forward, if you dare to talk, watch what happens.
3 months later, Larry King was jailed for the $40 million fraud. He was given a 15-year sentence, 10 years less than Alicia Owen. John DeCamp is now the only man fighting to help Larry King's victims. He's become the lawyer for Paul Benassi and Alicia Owen.
I live in Nebraska. Hell, I was born here, raised here. I have 4 kids growing up here. Like it or not, it's my heritage, you know. Well, if it's a dirty cesspool that I got to live in or look back on that I left, that ain't good. The real cost, if I were going to say to my family, has been the fear and intimidation that's put in some of the kids. A couple of the kids are really, really frightened and really had some sleeping problems over, you know, hear this or that. So that's been the real concern I've had.
In the face of mysterious threats, John has turned for advice to his friend and one-time boss, former head of the CIA, Bill Colby.
Old Bill Colby told me better than anything. The one thing that the bad people can't afford is publicity, and knocking you off right now or doing something obvious to one of your kids would bring them more trouble than it's worth.
I said, you have to consider the possibility of some danger to not only your reputation, but to your person. I mean, people do react rather violently to some kinds of charges, or particularly if they're true, there's more apt to be a negative reaction than if they're false. If they're false charges, then they can be reacted to in a normal way, by a libel suit or whatever. But if there's truth in it, there can be a danger in that situation. We've seen that happen in other cases.
John DeCamp has arranged to meet Troy Bonner, the young man he sees as the key to the cover-up.
He's in great danger. The reason is he carries the secret, so to speak. He served his purpose for the FBI and others by committing the lies that put the seal on the cover-up. His greatest safety probably lies in doing exactly what he knows he should do, that is exposing the whole thing, taking one final last chance and telling the truth.
My fears are that, you know, I'm not going to be believed again. It's just, you know, going to be a whole other kind of exploitation like it was last time. You know, and afraid that that's going to happen, or, you know, I might end up dead, or a loved one might end up dead again. I want this to go forward and have something done so that all those other kids who a lot worse, more worse things have happened to can come forward and see that action can be taken, because there are a lot of other kids out there that, you know, things happen to them that, you know, a lot worse than happened to me.
You have to, if you want to protect yourself and your life and your family's life, both now and particularly in the future, is to use the institutions of government that have been set up to protect you and make them work. That means you go into federal court, you go after the people that have done this cover-up, and you expose it so there's no longer any percentage on their part in eliminating you because the secret's out.
That's why we're here today, to let it out.
I have no doubt that he's now telling the truth, number one, and number two, that he originally told the truth. Potentially, they could decide to charge him with perjury, because now he is telling that they forced me to lie. I did lie at Alicia's trial. I did lie before the grand jury. I did it because the authorities were forcing me to do it, and I was scared for my family. My brother had been killed when I tried to back out the one time. Potentially, they could charge him with perjury this time.
Alicia Owen is out of prison and on bail, while DeCamp appeals against her perjury conviction. As he prepares for a court hearing, new evidence of the cover-up emerges, and once again it involves Troy Bonner's evidence.
The tapes that were shown to the grand jury had been edited. Everything that matched Troy's statement
Was shown.
that matched mine
'Cause I know it's
was
reason.
edited out. And I think maybe one of the things we want to do is show the judge specifically how, where these, little 5-minute segments of, look, this tape says this, and then show him it isn't in this tape, and this is the tape the grand jury saw.
I'm going to attempt to get these tapes, and we'll see what happens next.
But to obtain the evidence, DeCamp must approach some of the very officials he believes were involved in the cover-up, the county attorney's office which ran the grand jury.
In the good old Alicia Owen case, 127-194, I'm trying to get the evidence, the tapes and the transcripts of Troy and Danny, Troy Bonner.
It's up at the county attorneys. They have all the bills up there.
Oh.
Robert.
Let me guess, Robert Siegler has them.
Robert Siegler is the prosecuting attorney fighting to send Alicia Owen back to prison. After lengthy negotiations, DeCamp emerges with the tapes the grand jury never saw.
I went with $4,000. I bought $4,000 of cocaine.
Okay, and what airline?
I flew out of American.
Okay, and did you go direct?
No, there was a stopover in Denver. No, it was a stopover in Dallas-Fort Worth.
So you went from where to where to where?
I went from Omaha to Dallas-Fort Worth, like an hour, and then a big plane from Dallas to Los Angeles.
Right. Did anybody go with you?
Alicia Owen.
If this indeed were left out of the grand jury proceedings, then I am totally shocked and angry beyond words. Here it is, so to speak, the smoking gun that they could go out and verify, the corroboration. In other words, the linkage to King that was denied. Cover-up. Organized, planned, deliberate cover-up.
The courthouse, Wahoo, Nebraska. The hearings begin. Alicia Owen is ready to testify. So too is Paul Benassi. But there is no sign of Troy Bonner. DeCamp discovers that Robert Siegler has sent the young man a threatening subpoena. Fearing arrest for perjury, Troy has gone into hiding.
Let's try and subpoena him for these guys. Is Troy okay? Yeah, he's okay. They're just not going to have me testify until after he does. Okay, Troy's not here. Where's Alicia? No. Is she there?
In court, DeCamp successfully pleads for another adjournment. The county attorney's office begins to search for Troy Bonner, but Robert Siegler won't say why. Ask you whether you're about to charge Troy Bonner with perjury.
Oh, no.
Why no comment, Mr. Siegler? You're a public official, aren't you? Mr. Siegler, is it true you are about to charge Troy Bonner with perjury?
No comment.
Mr. Siegler, if you do not charge Troy Bonner with perjury, does that mean you accept what he's saying is true?
No comment.
Why are you trying to have Troy Bonner summoned to this hearing, Mr. Siegler?
No comment.
Why no comment, Mr. Siegler?
No comment. Every victim witness who stepped forward in any way, or even was a potential witness that somebody heard about, has either been killed, put in jail under some theory or other, terrified or run out of the state, discredited. Every perpetrator, even the convicted ones, have been treated as conquering heroes. Obviously, the FBI was protecting something a lot more significant than a bunch of old pedophiles having improper relations with little boys. They were protecting something a lot more significant than a bunch of drug peddlers. They were protecting, in my opinion, they were protecting some very prominent politicians, some very powerful and wealthy individuals associated with those politicians and the political system, up to and including the highest political people in this entire country.
So now what levels, I mean, you mentioned previously that essentially these kids were brought to Washington, D.C. for certain pedophile parties. What level could you discern this actually went to as far as political power? I mean, Lawrence King is not someone who's known to most people, but are we talking about politicians that are known to the public?
Absolutely. In my investigation, Senator Schmidt, who headed the Franklin Committee, as I said earlier, was told that a caller told him not to pursue this investigation because it would go to the upper echelons of the Republican Party. And in my investigation, I've seen that it does go to the upper echelons of the Republican Party, and there's also a number of high-ranking Democrats, too. But if one steps back and they look at the power that was deployed to cover this up, okay, you had the Department of Justice in Nebraska, you had a hijacked grand jury in Nebraska, a hijacked state grand jury, and then you had a hijacked federal grand jury. And then in Washington, D.C., you had the Department of Justice and the Secret Service and also another hijacked grand jury. So you've got strings being pulled from the pinnacle of power to orchestrate this cover-up. And the fact that there's so many people involved in this cover-up really shows just how transcontinental this pedophile network was.
In search of answers, John DeCamp goes to Washington to investigate Larry King's powerful connections in the nation's capital. Paul Benassi has come too. Larry King threw child sex parties at his $5,000 a month Washington house. Paul Benassi was one of the victims.
Larry King's house down in Washington, D.C. was a nice house. It was on what they, I believe it was Embassy Row, because that's what they kept talking about. There were a lot of flags from different countries when you drove around in the area.
So tell me, Paul, how often did you come here?
I was about 14, about 1981, and at first it was about 3 or 4 times the first year. After that it was about once a month after 81.
And who brought you here?
Larry King brought me here.
And this is the actual house where you...
Yes.
And what, you were used for sex there?
Yes. Some of the parties, when they started off, were straight political type parties with no sex. And then when some of the men had left, some of the politicians had left, the ones that had planned on engaging in some type of sexual activity, that would come after the party. Some of the kids would be held downstairs in some of the rooms where if they acted up or if they started freaking out because of the drugs that they were on, they'd put them in a room that they couldn't get out of, and they'd lock them in.
Were there drugs at these parties?
Yes.
What kind of drugs?
Anything you wanted. Cocaine, heroin, speedballs.
You're telling me those things were at these parties where you had Larry King and prominent politicians?
Yes.
Were they readily available to anybody at the party?
At the after parties, they were readily available for anybody. Beforehand, they did it more upstairs than they did anywhere else, and it was kind of in the back rooms.
Were any attempts ever made that you know of to expose this situation?
As far as I know, nothing's ever been done, and most of the people that were in there had already been, I guess you could say, compromised.
King's partner in sex crime was powerful Washington lobbyist Craig Spence. He took youngsters like Benassi on midnight tours of the White House.
So you were in the White House then?
Yes.
And how did you gain access?
Well, I came down with Larry King, but Craig Spence was the one that arranged the trip for us. And it was kind of a gift for our services that we were doing.
How many times were you on this kind of a trip?
I came to it on 2 times.
2 times. And were you used for sex on those occasions?
Not until after we left.
After you left the White House?
Yes.
What time of night?
It was usually around midnight. me, it was just kind of weird being in the White House at that time of the night, and getting to go into places that the guy was telling us that nobody gets to go to. I mean, I've seen rooms in there that I'd never even heard about. Craig Spence and Larry King had a couple of groups. One was called Bodies by God, and they had the Cowboys, and there was another group that was started by Larry King, which is called the Golden Boys, which was kids that were usually under the age of approximately 10.
Now, around the same time, in the late 80s, if I'm correct, it was actually before, it was at the end of, near the end of Reagan's term. The Washington Times had a famous story about basically a homosexual escort ring that was being led into the White House after hours. Is there any indication that this, because obviously homosexuality and pedophilia are two different issues, but is there any connection between this story that broke and the pedophile rings that were known to operate?
The Washington Times articles were boring into this story. They were boring into Craig Spence. Craig Spence had the house in Washington, D.C. that was wired for audiovisual blackmail, where a lot of the pedophilic orgies occurred. And he would take male prostitutes and, according to some people, underage prostitutes into the White House for midnight tours. And the person who had to take the fall for that, Craig Spence died under mysterious conditions like a lot of people in the Franklin scandal, but the person who ultimately took the fall for it ran an escort service, a gay escort service. His name was Henry Vinson. And he and I wrote a book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam, in which he gets into dealing with Craig Spence and Larry King and how difficult it was and how malevolent they were. And they pressured him to acquire children for them, and he refused to do that. And he also gets into how he came across Craig Spence's blackmail equipment firsthand. And then the Washington Times reported also that Craig Spence's house was fitted with a lot of blackmail equipment. So Craig Spence was definitely blackmailing upper echelon people in the Reagan and Bush administrations, and also senators and congressmen in his home.
On the trail of Craig Spence, DeCamp finds the investigative reporter who exposed Spence's callboy network, Paul Rodriguez of the Washington Times.
We had uncovered a series of allegations from some minors, and it led me to a callboy operation here in Washington.
Craig Spence's dad, he committed suicide. He had advanced stages of AIDS. He was an AIDS carrier and he killed himself. This was the thing that always bothered me. They claimed it was the largest male prostitution ring in the city that they've ever had uncovered. It was $1 million a year minimum.
Yeah.
And yet they only prosecuted the operator, Henry Vinson, and 3 of his lieutenants, as it were. Mm-hmm. They never went after any of the Johns or the clients. This operation, which was, again, quite large, claimed to have clients that ran from the White House to the Capitol Hill to the State House to the churches, within the media.
And that's precisely what Paul describes as the people he was with.
And a lot of the stuff led there, but we couldn't quite nail it in all cases because, again, to accuse someone of high stature, you've got to be very careful.
I understand.
We were able to do it through the mother lode was provided us credit card receipts and canceled checks, and then lists of the clients. The prosecutors knew all this stuff. There was approximately 20,000 pieces of 20,000 documents that they had. They sealed the entire record when they found out I was accessing it. They required consent agreements from all the lawyers, all the clients, all the relatives of all the clients, all the hookers, including the clients themselves.
Which means you can never gain access.
They sealed them by court order. And we've attempted on several occasions to unseal that, and we've been told it will be a cold day in hell before those records ever get unsealed. And it makes me wonder what's in those records.
Yeah.
The Attorney General is now involved. Bill Colby has passed DeCamp's evidence to a senior lawyer in the Justice Department.
He did say that the Attorney General's office would be very sensitive to any charges of abuse of children, that this was a matter of considerable priority to the department, that this sort of thing not take place, and that they would assign an officer to look into the case.
For John DeCamp, the story of Larry King's corrupt empire holds a dire warning for America.
If you can control about 3 or 4 key elements, you can totally own a state. You can make right wrong. You can make truth falsehood, falsehood truth. If you control the media, if you control the Justice Department, if you control the police, you own the system.
It's beyond belief that arguably the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States, in the form of Richard Nixon, could not prevent the investigation of Watergate, or that President Reagan could not prevent the investigation of Iran-Contra. And yet somehow this group of unnamed, unknown, anonymous individuals in Omaha, Nebraska have such power they can control and protect all of these people from being investigated. Those allegations are ridiculous.
Well, first of all, Nixon did cover up Watergate, number one. Bush did cover up Iran-Contra, at least officially. And Omaha has successfully covered up this situation. In each case, it was the press that exposed the problem. It wasn't institutions of government. They had been corrupted. They had been compromised. They were the ones doing the cover-up.
Some of the people he named were William Casey, who was head of the CIA, and Donald Gregg, who was George Herbert Walker Bush's national security advisor when Bush was vice president. And also some of the other people that have come out, Larry Craig, who was a senator. Henry named these people. And what happened with Henry is the corrupt grand jury in Washington, D.C. indicted him on a 43-count RICO indictment, which means that he was looking at approximately 300 years in prison. And the government said to him, okay, if you talk, we'll put you away for the rest of your life. But if you keep your mouth shut, we'll only put you away for 5 years. So Henry opted to not talk. And it's kind of amazing at this point that he's willing to come out. And we wrote Confessions of a D.C. Madam together.
The Justice Department, acting through FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Omaha, emerges from the record of the Franklin investigation, not so much as a party to the cover-up, but as its coordinator. Rigging grand juries, harassment of witnesses, incitement to perjury, and tampering with evidence, federal personnel were seen to apply all those techniques in the Franklin case.